The memories that constitute who you are right now are not what you think they are. The recollections that you carry of your childhood, of the persons who have shaped you, of the events that you believe make you the specific individual reading these words, are not the stable archival records that the dominant cultural framework treats them as. The memories are reconstructions that occur each time you access them, with the reconstructions involving substantial modification of the original encoding through the very act of remembering. The persons you believe you remember from your childhood are not the persons who actually were there. The events you believe shaped you are not the events that actually occurred. The continuous narrative of your life that you carry in your mind is largely a creative reconstruction that the brain produces in real time, with the reconstruction being so seamless that you experience it as direct access to the past rather than as the active production that it actually is. The findings of contemporary neuroscience that have established these recognitions across the past several decades have been among the most consequential developments in our understanding of what consciousness actually involves, and the implications for what you actually are as a remembering being deserve sustained attention. The starting point for any serious inquiry into memory is the foundational work of Erich Kandel, the Austrian-born American neuroscientist, whose research on the cellular and molecular mechanisms of memory earned him the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2000. Kandel's research, conducted across decades primarily at Columbia University, established the basic biological mechanisms by which memories are formed at the level of individual neurons and synapses. The research used the marine snail Aplysia californica as a model organism, with the relative simplicity of its nervous system allowing for detailed investigation of the changes that occur when the organism learns and remembers. The findings established that memory formation involves specific changes in synaptic strength between neurons, with the changes being mediated by specific molecular processes that Kandel and his collaborators worked out in detail. The discovery of long-term potentiation as a fundamental mechanism of memory storage, the identification of the specific genes and proteins involved in memory consolidation, and the characterization of the relationship between short-term and long-term memory at the cellular level have all been foundational contributions that subsequent research has continued to build upon. The work has been extended by numerous subsequent researchers across the past several decades, with the broader picture that has emerged being substantially more sophisticated than the simple metaphor of memory as storage that earlier models had proposed. The brain does not contain memories in the way that a computer contains files. The brain contains patterns of synaptic strength that produce specific patterns of neural activity when the appropriate cues activate them, with the patterns being themselves the memories rather than encodings of memories that exist somewhere else. The distinction is not merely terminological. The distinction has substantial implications for how memory should be understood, with the recognition that memories are dynamic patterns rather than static records being one of the central insights that contemporary memory research has produced. The most striking development in the field has been the work on memory reconsolidation, conducted by Karim Nader at McGill University and his collaborators across the past 2 decades. Nader's research, published in a foundational 2000 paper in the journal Nature, demonstrated that memories are not stable once they are consolidated, but become labile each time they are retrieved, with a retrieval initiating a reconsolidation process during which the memory can be modified before being stored again. The research used fear conditioning paradigms in rodents to demonstrate that memories that had been stable for weeks could be eliminated by interfering with the reconsolidation process during retrieval, with the elimination being specific to the memory that had been retrieved. The findings transformed the field, establishing that memory is fundamentally a reconstructive process rather than a retrieval process, with each act of remembering involving modification of the memory that is being remembered. The implications of the reconsolidation findings for understanding what memory actually is have been substantial. The traditional metaphor of memory as a kind of archival storage system, with memories being filed away after consolidation and retrieved intact when needed, cannot accommodate the reconsolidation phenomenon. The metaphor that has been increasingly adopted in the field is that of memory as a continuously updated reconstruction, with each retrieval being an act of construction that draws on the available materials but produces something new, rather than reproducing something that already existed. The implications for how human beings relate to their own pasts are direct. The memories that constitute the felt sense of personal continuity are not records of what actually happened. The memories are reconstructions that happen now, with the reconstructions being shaped by current cognitive and emotional states as well as by the materials that the original encoding produced. The work has been extended by Daniela Schiller at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York, whose research on memory reconsolidation in humans has documented that the same mechanisms that operate in rodents also operate in human beings. Schiller's research, summarized in her influential papers and her broader public communications, has shown that traumatic memories can be modified through specifically timed interventions that take advantage of the reconsolidation window. The clinical implications have been substantial, with new therapeutic approaches for post-traumatic stress disorder being developed on the basis of these findings. The broader implications for understanding memory have been even more substantial, with the research establishing that the reconstruction process operates in human beings just as it does in the animal models that Nader's foundational work used. The complementary line of research conducted by Joseph LeDoux at New York University has illuminated the specific role of the amygdala in fear-related memory, with LeDoux's work establishing that emotional memories are processed through partially distinct neural circuits from those that handle more neutral content. LeDoux's research, summarized in his books The Emotional Brain and Synaptic Self, has documented how the amygdala-based fear memory system operates with characteristics that distinguish it from the hippocampus-based explicit memory system, with the implications for how traumatic memories are stored and retrieved being significant. The integration of LeDoux's work with the broader research on reconsolidation has produced one of the most sophisticated, contemporary accounts of how emotional memories work, with the implications for understanding what we actually carry from our pasts being substantial. The findings have particular relevance for understanding why traumatic memories are often experienced with the intrusive vividness that distinguishes them from ordinary autobiographical recall. The amygdala-based fear memory system operates with timescales and integration patterns that produce memories with specific features including involuntary intrusion, somatic intensity, and resistance to deliberate modification. The recognition that these features follow from the specific neural mechanisms involved, rather than from any malfunction of memory, has substantial clinical implications, with therapeutic approaches that work with, rather than against these mechanisms, producing more effective treatment outcomes than approaches that treat traumatic memory as merely defective autobiographical memory. The foundational work of Endel Tulving, the Estonian-Canadian psychologist whose contributions to memory research across the second half of the 20th century have been among the most influential in the field, established several distinctions that have become central to contemporary memory theory. Tulving distinguished episodic memory, the memory for specific events that we have personally experienced, from semantic memory, the general knowledge about the world that does not depend on remembering specific learning episodes. The distinction has been the foundation for substantial subsequent research, with the recognition that different memory systems operate through different neural mechanisms and produce different kinds of conscious experience. Tulving's articulation of episodic memory as involving mental time travel, the capacity to project oneself back into one's own past or forward into one's own future, has been one of the most influential frameworks in contemporary memory science. The work has been developed by Daniel Schacter at Harvard University, whose research on the constructive nature of memory has produced some of the most accessible articulations of these findings for general readers. Schacter's books, including Searching for Memory and The 7 Sins of Memory, have documented the various ways that memory fails, with the failures being not bugs in the system but features that follow from the constructive nature of memory itself. The 7 sins that Schacter identified include transience, the gradual loss of detail over time, absent-mindedness, the failure to encode adequately in the first place, blocking, the temporary inability to retrieve information that is actually stored, misattribution, the assignment of memories to wrong sources, suggestibility, the modification of memories by subsequent suggestions, bias, the distortion of memory by current attitudes and beliefs, and persistence, the inability to suppress memories that one would prefer to forget. The framework provides a comprehensive account of how memory operates in actual human beings, with the understanding being that these features are intrinsic to memory rather than malfunctions that better engineering could eliminate. A particularly important line of research has been pursued by Elizabeth Loftus at the University of California, Irvine, whose work on the malleability of memory has produced findings that have transformed both psychological theory and legal practice. Loftus's research, conducted across decades and summarized in her books, including Memory and Witness for the Defense, has documented that memories can be substantially modified through suggestion, with subjects coming to remember events that never occurred when appropriately prompted. The famous Lost in the Mall studies, in which subjects came to remember being lost in shopping malls as children, when family members provided fabricated accounts of such incidents, have been among the most striking demonstrations of how readily memory can be reshaped. The findings have substantial implications for the reliability of eyewitness testimony, with the implications having been worked out in legal contexts, where the limitations of memory have begun to be incorporated into how courts evaluate evidence. The earlier foundational work that Loftus conducted on eyewitness memory in the 1970s established the basic findings that subsequent research has continued to develop. The 1974 study with John Palmer documented that the language used in questioning eyewitnesses substantially affects what they subsequently remember, with subjects who were asked how fast cars were going when they smashed into each other, reporting higher speeds and more broken glass than subjects who were asked how fast cars were going when they hit each other. The findings establish that memory is not merely retrieved, but actively reconstructed in response to the cues that the retrieval situation provides, with the reconstruction being shaped by features of the questioning that the rememberer is typically unaware of. The implications for legal practice have been substantial, with the recognition that eyewitness testimony is far less reliable than the legal system traditionally assumed having begun to influence how such testimony is evaluated. The work has been extended by various subsequent researchers, with a broader picture of memory's malleability being substantially documented across multiple research programs. The work of Henry Roediger at Washington University in St. Louis on false memories has documented how readily subjects come to remember words that were not actually presented to them when the words are semantically related to words that were presented. The Dease-Roediger-McDermott paradigm, developed through this research, has provided one of the most reliable laboratory demonstrations of the constructive nature of memory. The findings establish that the distinction between true and false memories is not as clear as ordinary intuition suggests, with the same neural mechanisms producing both kinds of recollection and the subjective experience of remembering being similar across both. The convergence of these various research programs has produced a picture of memory that is substantially more sophisticated than the simple storage metaphor that earlier thinking assumed. The picture treats memory as a continuously active process of reconstruction, with the brain generating the experience of remembering by drawing on patterns of synaptic strength that have been modified by previous experiences. The patterns are not themselves memories in the sense of being encoded representations of past events, The patterns are dispositions for the brain to produce certain configurations of neural activity in response to certain cues, with the configurations being the experiences of remembering rather than the retrieval of stored content. The distinction has substantial philosophical implications, with the recognition that memory is fundamentally a constructive process, raising questions about what relationship the experience of remembering actually has to the past events that the experience seems to be about. The work of Karl Pribram, whose career at Stanford University and later at Georgetown University produced one of the most striking alternative frameworks for understanding memory, deserves particular attention because of its specific implications for how memory might be understood at the deepest level. Pribram's holographic brain hypothesis, developed in collaboration with the physicist David Bohm and articulated across numerous papers and his book Brain and Perception, proposes that the brain encodes information through holographic principles, with each part of the brain containing information about the whole. The framework was motivated by Pribram's clinical observations that brain damage rarely eliminates specific memories in the way that the simple storage model would predict, with the patterns of memory deficit following damage being more consistent with distributed encoding than with localized storage. The framework was further motivated by the formal similarities between the mathematical structures of holography and the patterns of neural activity that the brain exhibits. The historical context for Pribram's framework includes the foundational work of Karl Lashley, the American psychologist whose decades of research on the location of memory in the brain produced one of the most striking empirical puzzles in the history of memory research. Lashley's research, summarized in his 1950 paper, In Search of the Engram, documented that he had been unable to localize specific memories in specific brain regions, despite extensive systematic investigation. The engram, the proposed physical trace of memory that was supposed to be located somewhere in the brain, proved consistently elusive in Lashley's experiments. Lesions of various brain regions impaired memory in proportion to the size of the lesion rather than producing the loss of specific memories that the localized storage model would predict. The findings constituted what Lashley himself characterized as a paradox, with the failure to find localized memories suggesting that the simple storage model could not be correct even as the alternative was unclear. Pribram's holographic framework provided one of the most coherent alternatives to the localized storage model, accounting for Lashley's findings through the distributed encoding that the holographic principles would predict. The framework holds that memory is not stored at specific locations but is rather encoded across the entire system through patterns that allow any part to contain information about the whole. The framework has parallels with the Fourier analysis that mathematically underlies the technical understanding of holography, with the brain operating as a kind of Fourier transformer that encodes information in the frequency domain rather than in the spatial domain. The implications for understanding memory follow directly. Memories are not specific traces stored at specific locations. Memories are patterns of activity that can be reconstructed from any sufficiently complete portion of the system, with the distributed encoding ensuring resilience to localized damage and providing the apparent capacity to retrieve complete memories from fragmentary cues that everyday experience demonstrates. The implications of Pribram's framework for understanding memory have been substantial, even as the framework has remained controversial within mainstream neuroscience. The framework provides resources for understanding why memory is so resilient to localized damage, with the holographic encoding, ensuring that information is distributed across the entire system rather than being stored in specific locations that damage could eliminate. The framework provides resources for understanding the apparent capacity of the brain to recognize patterns from partial information, with the holographic encoding allowing the reconstruction of complete memories from fragmentary cues. The framework provides resources for thinking about how memory might involve features of physical reality that exceed what the merely classical framework can capture, with the holographic principles having been developed in connection with quantum mechanical investigations that have implications for the deeper structure of reality. The collaboration between Pribram and Bohm produced specific articulations of how the holographic brain framework relates to the broader implicate order framework that Bohm was developing in physics. The collaboration argued that the brain operates as a kind of frequency analyzer, with the patterns of neural activity being the brain's engagement with the underlying frequency domain that the implicate order framework articulates. The framework has been controversial within both neuroscience and physics, but the framework has continued to be influential among researchers working at the intersection of these fields, with the convergence between the holographic encoding that Pribram identified and the broader frameworks that physics has developed being one of the features that has motivated continued engagement with this work. The philosophical engagement with memory has its own substantial history that runs parallel to the empirical research. The work of Henri Bergson, the French philosopher whose 1896 book Matter and Memory has been one of the most influential philosophical treatments of these questions, articulated a framework within which memory is understood as fundamentally different from the storage model that the materialist framework would suggest. Bergson distinguished what he called pure memory, which he understood as something that exists outside the brain and that the brain accesses rather than contains, from habit memory, which involves the learned bodily patterns that the materialist framework can adequately address. The framework has been controversial, but the framework has been one of the most sophisticated philosophical attempts to articulate why the merely materialist account of memory may not capture what memory actually involves. Bergson's argument for the distinction between pure memory and habit memory drew on careful observation of clinical cases that the materialist framework had difficulty fully addressing. The cases included patients with specific forms of amnesia that affected one kind of memory while leaving the other intact, with the dissociations suggesting that the two kinds of memory operate through different mechanisms and possibly involve different ontological statuses. Bergson's framework treats habit memory as embodied learning that the brain produces through repeated practice, with the practice modifying the bodily dispositions that subsequently express themselves as skilled action. Pure memory, on the framework, is treated as the actual record of past experience that exists in some form that does not depend on the brain for its preservation. The framework was developed in dialogue with the empirical research of Bergson's time, with the dialogue producing what remains one of the most rigorous philosophical articulations of why memory may involve features that the merely materialist framework cannot capture. The work of Edmund Husserl, the German philosopher whose phenomenological investigations of consciousness produced detailed analyses of how memory operates within the structure of conscious experience, articulated frameworks that have been developed by subsequent phenomenologists. Husserl's analysis of the temporal structure of consciousness, with its recognition that consciousness is not merely directed toward the present moment, but extends through what he called retention into the immediate past, and through pretension into the immediate future, provides one of the most rigorous philosophical accounts of how memory is woven into the very structure of consciousness, rather than being a separate cognitive function that operates on already constituted conscious experience. The framework has been developed by Maurice Merleau-Ponty and other phenomenologists, with the broader tradition continuing to provide resources for thinking about memory beyond what the materialist framework allows. Husserl's specific articulation of retention deserves particular attention because of its implications for understanding the temporal structure of consciousness itself. Retention is, on Husserl's analysis, not the storage of memories that have been completed, but the continuing presence of the just past within the structure of present consciousness. The melody that you are hearing right now is not heard as a sequence of isolated notes, but as a coherent musical phrase, with the phrase being available to consciousness only because the notes that have just sounded are retained in the structure of present experience, even as the current note is being processed. The recognition that consciousness has this temporal structure provides resources for understanding how the experience of remembering can have the specific phenomenology it has, with the phenomenology being grounded in the deeper temporal structure of consciousness itself rather than being a separate cognitive achievement. Maurice Merleau-Ponty, whose 1945 book, Phenomenology of Perception, developed the phenomenological tradition, with particular attention to the embodied character of perception and memory, articulated frameworks that have continued to be influential in contemporary discussions. Merleau-Ponty emphasized that memory is not a purely cognitive function, but is woven into the body's engagement with the world, with the body itself carrying patterns of memory that are expressed in skilled action and embodied recognition. The framework has substantial parallels with the contemporary research on procedural memory and embodied cognition, with the convergence between the phenomenological and empirical approaches being one of the features that the broader contemporary engagement with these questions has continued to develop. The contemporary philosophical engagement with these questions has continued to develop. The work of John Sutton at Macquarie University on the philosophy of memory, the work of Sven Bernecker on memory's relationship to knowledge, the work of various philosophers of mind on whether memory can be reductively explained in physical terms, have all contributed to a substantial body of contemporary philosophical reflection that engages seriously with the empirical findings, while also raising questions that the empirical findings alone cannot answer. The convergence between the philosophical and empirical engagements with memory has produced one of the more vigorous areas of contemporary scholarship, with the implications for understanding what memory actually involves continuing to be worked out. There is a particular feature of memory that current research has not been able to fully explain, and that points toward the deeper questions that the inquiry will eventually examine. The phenomenon of involuntary memory, the experience of being suddenly transported into a vivid recollection of a past event by some unexpected cue, has features that the standard cognitive accounts have difficulty fully addressing. The famous Proustian moment, in which the taste of a tea-soaked madeleine triggered the entire elaborated recollection of the narrator's childhood that constitutes the foundation of In Search of Lost Time, captures the phenomenology of involuntary memory in particularly vivid form. The experience involves not merely the recollection of specific facts about the past, but the apparent transport of the rememberer into a different temporal location, with the sensory and emotional textures of the remembered period being felt with an immediacy that ordinary deliberate memory rarely produces. The contemporary research on involuntary memory has documented the phenomenon as a real and reliable feature of how memory operates, with the work of Dorthe Berntsen at Aarhus University in Denmark providing some of the most extensive empirical investigation. Berntsen's research, summarized in her book Involuntary Autobiographical Memories, has established that involuntary memories occur with substantial frequency in everyday life, and that they have specific features that distinguish them from voluntary recall. The research has not, however, fully resolved the question of why involuntary memories have the particular phenomenology they have, with the apparent vividness and emotional intensity of these experiences exceeding what the standard cognitive accounts can fully explain. The phenomenon of involuntary memory raises questions that connect to the broader questions about consciousness that the inquiry has been pursuing. The vividness with which involuntary memories present themselves to consciousness, the apparent transport of the rememberer into a different temporal location, and the emotional intensity that often accompanies these experiences all suggest features of memory that exceed the merely cognitive reconstruction that the standard framework would describe. The implications for understanding what memory actually involves are significant. with the involuntary memory phenomenon being one of the features that motivates the deeper inquiry that the subsequent stages of this investigation will pursue. The contemplative traditions have, for thousands of years, addressed the questions about memory with their own different methods and within their own different frameworks. The Christian tradition has developed extensive theological reflection on memory, with Augustine of Hippo's Confessions containing one of the most philosophically sophisticated treatments of memory in the entire tradition. The Hindu tradition has articulated the doctrines of samskara and vasana, the latent impressions that actions and experiences produce in consciousness and that ripen into subsequent experiences across time. The Buddhist tradition has developed the analysis of Chittasantana, the mental continuum, as a framework within which memory operates without requiring a persistent self that does the remembering. The Platonic tradition has articulated the doctrine of anamnesis, recollection, as a framework within which the deepest knowledge is understood as remembering what the soul knew before embodiment. The Jewish tradition has placed the imperative zakor, remember, at the center of its religious life, with the obligation to remember being one of the most consistent themes of the tradition. The convergence between these traditional articulations and the contemporary research is one of the features that the inquiry will eventually examine in detail. What is striking about the convergence of these traditions is not merely that they all recognize memory as significant. What is striking is the specific structural features that recur across the different accounts. The traditions consistently treat memory as more than the merely cognitive function that the materialist framework treats it as, with the more being articulated in different vocabularies, but with the structural recognition being consistent. The traditions consistently distinguish between ordinary memory that operates through habitual mechanisms and deeper memory that involves access to dimensions of reality that the merely habitual access does not provide. The traditions consistently develop practices for the cultivation of memory, with the practices ranging from the contemplative recollection that the Christian tradition has developed to the cultivation of mindfulness that the Buddhist tradition has refined. And the traditions consistently locate memory within broader frameworks of meaning that connect the individual life to larger patterns that the individual life participates in. The convergence of these specific structural features across widely separated traditions, despite the different vocabularies and metaphysical frameworks within which the traditions operated, is one of the features that the inquiry will eventually examine in detail. The Augustinian treatment of memory in the 10th book of the Confessions deserves particular preliminary attention because of the depth with which it addresses the questions that contemporary research has been engaging from different directions. Augustine treats memory not merely as a cognitive function, but as a vast interior space within which the materials of conscious experience are encountered. The famous passage in which Augustine describes the fields and palaces of memory with their countless contents that consciousness can engage in various ways, captures the phenomenological richness of memory in language that subsequent reflection has continued to find rewarding. The treatment will be examined in detail in the later stage of the inquiry, but the preliminary recognition is that the Christian tradition has resources for thinking about memory that exceed what the merely materialist framework provides, with the resources being grounded in careful philosophical analysis rather than merely religious commitment. What the contemporary research has begun to suggest, when it is considered alongside these contemplative traditions, is that the question of what memory actually involves may not be the merely cognitive question that materialist frameworks have treated it as. The question may be a question about the fundamental structure of consciousness and its relationship to time, with answers that physics and philosophy and the contemplative traditions are all in a position to engage from their own different angles. The traditions, on this convergent reading, may have been articulating in their own pre-scientific vocabularies recognitions about the structure of memory that contemporary research is now in a position to confirm or refine through its own different methods. The convergence is not coincidence. The convergence is the consequence of the fact that the traditions were attending carefully to features of memory that have a real basis in how consciousness is actually structured, even when the technical resources for articulating this basis were not yet available. The body that reads these words has, across the years of its existence, accumulated what feels like a continuous record of experiences that constitutes the felt sense of who you are. The findings that contemporary research has documented suggest that this felt sense is substantially less accurate than ordinary perception would suggest. The memories that constitute the record are not stable archival records but continuously updated reconstructions. The persons you remember are not the persons you actually knew. The events you remember are not the events that actually occurred. The continuous self that the memories seem to support is itself a construction that the memory system produces in real time, with the construction being so seamless that it is mistaken for direct access to a continuous past. None of this is hypothetical. All of this is the documented condition of your actual existence as a remembering being. The question is what these findings actually mean, what they tell us about the nature of consciousness, and how the various frameworks that have been examining memory can be brought into productive engagement with each other. The next stage of the inquiry will examine the deeper physical theories that have been developed to address these questions, with particular attention to the work on quantum approaches to consciousness and to the broader frameworks within which the documented phenomena of memory can be understood as more than the merely cognitive constructions that the standard framework has assumed. There is something fundamentally wrong with the storage model of memory. The findings we have examined establish that memories are not stable archival records but continuously updated reconstructions, that the brain operates through distributed encoding rather than localized storage, and that the very experience of remembering is an active production rather than the retrieval of something that already existed. The cognitive science findings are real. The neural mechanisms are increasingly characterized. The phenomenology of constructive memory is well documented. But the standard neuroscience framework, despite the sophistication of its findings, leaves a deeper question unaddressed. The question concerns what the experience of remembering actually is when we have set aside the storage model that ordinary thinking assumed, and what kind of relationship the experience has to the past events that the experience seems to be about. The materialist framework treats memory as the brain's reconstruction of patterns that have been encoded through experience, with the reconstruction being the totality of what memory involves. But the materialist framework does not address whether memory might involve features of consciousness and reality that exceed what the merely neural reconstruction would account for. The question that opens the inquiry that follows is whether contemporary physics has anything to contribute to this deeper question, and what the implications might be for how the documented phenomena of memory should be understood. The starting point for this deeper inquiry is the holographic brain framework that we considered in our earlier examination of the foundational research on memory. The framework, developed by Karl Pribram in collaboration with the physicist David Bohm and articulated across decades of subsequent development, proposes that the brain encodes information through holographic principles that distribute information across the entire system rather than storing it at specific locations. The framework was motivated by the empirical puzzle that Lashley's research had identified, with the apparent impossibility of localizing specific memories in specific brain regions, suggesting that the simple storage model could not be correct. The framework provided a coherent alternative, with the holographic encoding accounting for the resilience of memory to localized damage and for the apparent capacity of partial cues to retrieve complete memories. The deeper implications of the holographic framework emerge when its mathematical structure is examined in detail. Holography in its technical sense involves the recording of three-dimensional information on a two-dimensional surface through interference patterns produced by coherent light, with the recording being such that any sufficiently large piece of the surface contains information about the entire three-dimensional scene. The mathematical structure that underlies holography is Fourier analysis, the technique by which complex patterns can be decomposed into combinations of simpler frequency components. The application of these mathematical structures to brain function suggests that the brain may operate through similar principles, with neural activity patterns being decomposable into frequency components that are distributed across the system rather than localized in specific regions. The framework provides resources for understanding why the brain exhibits the specific properties it does, including the distributed encoding, the resistance to localized damage, and the capacity for content-addressable retrieval. Pribram's specific articulation of these principles drew on extensive empirical work that had documented the role of frequency analysis in sensory processing. The visual system, as research had established across decades, operates through specific spatial frequency channels that decompose visual scenes into their component spatial frequencies before reconstructing the integrated perception. The auditory system operates through analogous frequency analysis, with the cochlea performing a kind of biological Fourier transform on incoming sound. The motor system has been documented to operate through frequency-based principles in the generation of complex movements. The cumulative effect of these findings supports the broader framework that the brain operates through frequency analysis at multiple levels, with the holographic encoding of memory being one specific application of these more general principles. The framework has been extended by various subsequent researchers, with the work of Walter Freeman at Berkeley on the dynamic patterns of cortical activity providing some of the most detailed empirical investigation of how the brain might operate through frequency-based principles. Freeman's research, conducted across decades and summarized in his influential papers on neurodynamics, documented that cortical activity exhibits specific frequency patterns that change as information is processed, with the patterns having features that are consistent with the kind of distributed encoding that the holographic framework would predict. The integration of Freeman's findings with Pribram's broader framework has produced one of the most sophisticated contemporary articulations of how the brain might operate through frequency-based principles, even as the framework remains controversial within the broader neuroscience community. The connection between Pribram's holographic brain framework and Boehm's broader implicate order framework deserves particular attention because it suggests a deeper level at which memory may operate. Boehm's framework, articulated most fully in his 1980 book Wholeness and the Implicate Order, proposes that the physical reality we ordinarily encounter is an unfolding of a deeper underlying reality through processes that operate according to specific structural principles. The implicate order is, on the framework, the level at which information is distributed across the entire system, with specific manifestations in the explicate order being the unfoldings of patterns that exist in compressed form at the deeper level. The convergence between this framework and the holographic brain framework is substantial. Both frameworks treat reality as fundamentally distributed rather than localized, with specific manifestations being unfoldings of patterns that exist in distributed form. The convergence has motivated extensive subsequent work at the intersection of physics and neuroscience, with the implications for understanding what memory actually involves continuing to be developed. Boehm's specific concept of the hollow movement provides additional resources for thinking about memory within this broader framework. The hollow movement is, on Boehm's articulation, the fundamental movement of which the explicate order is a manifestation, with the movement being a continuous unfolding and enfolding through which the apparent stability of objects in the explicate order is generated. Memory, on this framework, can be understood as the brain's engagement with the hollow movement, with the patterns that we experience as memories being unfoldings of patterns that exist in the deeper level. The framework provides resources for understanding why memory has the specific features it has, with the apparent retrieval of specific events being the unfolding of patterns that have been enfolded in the deeper structure, rather than the retrieval of records that have been stored at specific locations. The implications of this convergent framework for understanding memory are substantial. If the brain operates through holographic principles, with memory being encoded in distributed patterns rather than localized records, and if the broader physical reality operates through implicate order principles, with information being distributed across the system rather than localized in specific events, then memory may involve a level of access to the broader informational structure of reality that the merely neurocognitive framework cannot capture. The memories that we experience are not, on this framework, merely the brain's reconstructions from internally stored patterns. The memories may be the brain's engagement with patterns that exist in the broader informational structure of reality, with the engagement being the means by which the patterns become accessible to consciousness rather than the totality of what the patterns are. The framework is speculative in its specific applications, but it provides resources for thinking about memory beyond the merely materialist framework that the standard cognitive science assumes. The careful position with respect to this framework requires acknowledging the speculative status of its specific applications. The Pribram holographic framework has been controversial within mainstream neuroscience, with the framework not being incorporated into the consensus understanding of how the brain operates. The Bohm implicate order framework has been controversial within mainstream physics, with the framework not being incorporated into the consensus understanding of how physical reality is structured. The application of these frameworks to specific questions about memory involves theoretical extensions that have not been definitively established within either the neuroscience or the physics community. The frameworks offer resources for thinking about memory beyond what the materialist framework allows, but the resources are resources for formulation rather than for demonstration. The inquiry has to maintain this distinction throughout its engagement with these topics, neither dismissing the framework's relevance nor claiming for them more than the frameworks actually establish. The work of Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff on the quantum substrate of consciousness, which we considered in earlier inquiries, has direct implications for how memory should be understood at the deepest level. The orchestrated objective reduction theory holds that consciousness is associated with quantum coherent states in microtubules within neurons, with the moment-to-moment generation of conscious experience involving the orchestrated collapse of these quantum states. The framework has implications for how memory should be understood within the broader picture of consciousness that the framework articulates. If consciousness is itself a quantum mechanical phenomenon, then memory may involve features of quantum mechanics that the merely classical framework cannot capture. The specific implications have been articulated by Hameroff and his collaborators across various publications, with the framework providing resources for thinking about why memory has the specific properties it has, including its capacity for non-local access and its resistance to simple localization within the brain. The specific predictions of the framework for memory storage have been articulated in considerable detail. Hameroff has proposed that memories may be encoded in the specific patterns of microtubule conformational states, with the patterns being maintained through the quantum coherent processes that the framework identifies as the substrate of consciousness. The proposal has implications for understanding why memory has the specific resilience properties it exhibits. The microtubule lattice provides a substrate for information storage that is distributed across the neural system rather than localized in specific synaptic connections, with the distribution being consistent with the holographic principles that Pribram's framework identified independently. The convergence between the Penrose-Hameroff framework and the Pribram-Bohm framework on the recognition that memory operates through distributed processes that exceed what the merely synaptic framework allows is one of the more striking convergences in contemporary research on these questions. The empirical work that has been conducted to test the predictions of the orchestrated objective reduction framework has produced findings of substantial interest for understanding memory. The work of Anirban Bandyopadhyay at the National Institute for Materials Science in Japan, conducted in collaboration with Hameroff, has documented quantum coherent vibrations in microtubules under physiologically relevant conditions, with the findings being consistent with the framework's predictions. The 2024 work of Mike Wiest and his collaborators at Wellesley College, examining the effects of microtubule stabilizing anesthetics on consciousness, has provided additional empirical support for the broader framework, with the studies documenting that anesthetics that bind to microtubules produce specific effects on consciousness that are consistent with the predictions of the orchestrated objective reduction theory. The implications for understanding memory follow from the same theoretical foundation, with memory being a particular configuration of the quantum coherent processing that the framework identifies as the substrate of consciousness in general. The recognition that time may not have the structure that ordinary perception suggests it has provides another framework within which the questions about memory can be reformulated. The block universe interpretation of relativity, articulated most fully in the philosophical work of various physicists and philosophers, holds that the past, present, and future all exist with equal reality, with the apparent flow of time being a feature of conscious experience rather than a feature of the underlying physical structure. The framework derives from the implications of special relativity for the relationship between simultaneity and reference frames, with different observers having different definitions of what counts as simultaneous and the implications for any privilege present being substantial. The framework has been articulated by physicists including Hermann Minkowski in the early 20th century and developed by subsequent thinkers including Hilary Putnam, Brian Greene, and various others working at the intersection of physics and philosophy. The implications of the block universe framework for understanding memory are striking. If the past exists with equal reality to the present on the framework, then the question of what memory actually accesses takes on a different shape than the merely materialist framework would suggest. The past events that memory seems to be about are, on the framework, all there in the broader space-time structure, regardless of where they fall in the experience sequence of any particular observer. The memories that we experience are not, on this framework, merely the brain's reconstructions from internally stored patterns. The memories may be the consciousness's engagement with events that genuinely exist in the broader space-time structure, with the engagement being the means by which the past becomes accessible to present consciousness rather than the production of internal representations of events that no longer exist. The framework is speculative in its specific applications to memory, but it provides a precise vocabulary within which the question of what memory actually accesses can be formulated in ways that exceed what the merely materialist framework allows. The convergence between the block universe framework and the Bergsonian distinction between pure memory and habit memory deserves particular attention. Bergson's claim that pure memory exists outside the brain and is accessed by it, rather than contained within it, has substantial structural parallels with what the block universe framework would suggest about the relationship between memory and the past. If the past exists with equal reality to the present in the broader space-time structure, then the brain is not the container of memories, but the means by which memories of the past become accessible to present consciousness. The framework has been speculative across the more than a century since Bergson articulated it, but the convergence between Bergson's philosophical framework and the contemporary physical framework of the block universe is one of the more striking convergences in the history of these questions, with the implications for understanding what memory actually involves continuing to be developed. The work on retrocausality and the time-symmetric formulation of quantum mechanics by Yakir Aharonov and his collaborators provides additional resources that bear on the questions about memory. The two-state vector formalism, articulated by Aharonov and his colleagues across many papers, treats quantum systems as being constrained by both initial and final boundary conditions, with the present state of the system being shaped by both its past and its future. The implications of this framework for memory are subtle but significant. If the present states of physical systems, including brains, are constrained by future as well as past boundary conditions on the framework, then the memories that the brain produces may be shaped by the future trajectory of the brain, as well as by the past events that the memories seem to be about. The framework is speculative in its specific applications to memory, but it provides a precise vocabulary within which the question of how memory might involve future as well as past influences can be formulated. The implications for the apparent reconstructive nature of memory follow naturally from this framework. The fact that memories are reconstructed each time they are retrieved, with the reconstruction being shaped by current cognitive and emotional states, may have features that exceed what the merely cognitive framework can capture. If the present states are constrained by future boundary conditions, then the reconstructions may be shaped by where the rememberer is going, as well as by where they have been, with the reconstructions having a structural meaningfulness that the merely retrospective view cannot fully appreciate. The framework remains speculative, but the resources it provides for thinking about why memory operates the way it does are substantial. There is a particular set of claims that has been made in popular literature on memory that deserves explicit examination because it has been the source of substantial confusion. The claims involve the proposition that memory provides access to past lives that the dreamer or rememberer has lived in previous incarnations, with the specific contents of these claimed past life memories being treated as evidence of reincarnation in the literal sense. These claims have appeared in various books and articles that have presented themselves as bringing scientific evidence to bear on questions about reincarnation. The claims have to be addressed directly because they distort what the actual research establishes, and because they have shaped popular understanding of these topics in ways that exceed what the science supports. The careful position requires distinguishing between different aspects of these claims. The work of Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia, conducted across decades and continued by his successor Jim Tucker, has documented cases of children who report memories of previous lives that include specific, verifiable details about the lives of deceased persons. The methodological rigor of this research has been substantial, with the cases being investigated through interviews with the children, their families, and the families of the deceased persons whose lives the children claim to remember. The findings have been controversial within mainstream science, but the findings have not been definitively explained by ordinary cognitive mechanisms despite decades of subsequent investigation. The research is not what the popular claims have made of it, but the research has documented phenomena that warrant serious engagement rather than summary dismissal. Stevenson's research, summarized across his multi-volume work, Cases of the Reincarnation Type, and his books for general readers, including Children Who Remember, Previous Lives, documented over 2,500 cases across various cultures over a period of more than 4 decades. The cases included specific verifiable details that the children could not have acquired through ordinary means, including the names and circumstances of deceased persons, specific physical details of locations the children had not visited, and in some cases, birthmarks or birth defects that corresponded to the manner of death of the previous person. The methodology that Stevenson developed for investigating these cases has been adopted by subsequent researchers, with Tucker's work at the University of Virginia continuing the research program with contemporary methodological refinements. Tucker's books, including Life Before Life and Return to Life, have summarized the continuing research for general readers, with the methodological care being substantial even as the broader framework remains controversial. The careful evaluation of this research requires acknowledging both what it has documented and what it has not established. The research has documented specific cases that resist easy reduction to ordinary cognitive mechanisms, with the verifiable details exceeding what cryptomnesia or coincidence would predict in some specific instances. The research has not established that the documented phenomena involve literal reincarnation in the form that some traditions teach, with the specific interpretation being a metaphysical addition to the empirical findings, rather than a direct implication of them. The honest position is to take the research seriously as research, with all its methodological strengths and limitations, while resisting both the dismissal that would deny what the research has actually documented and the overinterpretation that would treat the documented phenomena as definitive evidence for specific reincarnation doctrines. The phenomena are real. What they ultimately mean remains an open question that continued research is working to address. What the popular claims have often added to the actual research is a metaphysical framework within which the documented phenomena are interpreted as definitive evidence for specific reincarnation doctrines. The framework goes beyond what the actual research establishes and beyond what the careful application of the research would warrant. The phenomena that Stevenson and Tucker have documented are real phenomena that resist easy reduction to ordinary cognitive mechanisms. The specific interpretation of these phenomena as evidence for the literal reincarnation that some traditions teach is a metaphysical addition to the empirical findings, rather than a direct implication of them. The honest engagement with this research requires distinguishing what has actually been established from what has been added through cultural projection and interpretive overreach. The research is interesting, but the popular literature has often presented it in forms that exceed what the careful application of the research would support. The popular claims that have made memories evidence for specific spiritual frameworks deserve particular caution. The claims that include specific past life identifications, the claims that include elaborate karmic narratives connecting current circumstances to specific past life events, the claims that include therapeutic techniques for accessing past life memories are all distortions of what careful inquiry has actually established. The contemplative traditions did teach doctrines of reincarnation in various forms, but they taught these doctrines within frameworks of moral and spiritual seriousness that the popular distortions abandon. The contemporary research has documented phenomena that resist materialist reduction, but the research has not established the specific narratives that the popular literature has constructed. The honest engagement with these questions requires distinguishing what has actually been established from what has been added through cultural projection and commercial exploitation. The phenomenon of past life regression therapy, in which subjects under hypnosis report apparent past life memories, deserves particular examination because it has been one of the most widely promoted contemporary frameworks for accessing alleged past life memories. The technique was popularized by various practitioners, including Brian Weiss, whose 1988 book, Many Lives, Many Masters, became one of the most widely read works in this genre. The careful evaluation of this technique requires acknowledging that the contemporary research on hypnosis has documented that hypnotic suggestion can produce vivid subjective experiences that have no basis in actual past events, with the experiences being indistinguishable to the subject from genuine memories. The work of Elizabeth Loftus and other researchers on suggestibility has provided substantial documentation of how readily memory-like content can be generated through hypnotic suggestion, with the implications for past life regression being clear. The technique cannot reliably produce evidence of past lives because the technique itself produces vivid subjective experiences that may have no basis in any actual events. The research that Stevenson and Tucker have conducted, by contrast, focuses on spontaneous memories in young children that occur without hypnotic suggestion, with the methodological rigor being substantially greater than the regression technique allows. What the popular claims have often added to the actual research is a metaphysical framework within which the documented phenomena are interpreted as definitive evidence for specific reincarnation doctrines. The framework goes beyond what the actual research establishes and beyond what the careful application of the research would warrant. The phenomena that Stevenson and Tucker have documented are real phenomena that resist easy reduction to ordinary cognitive mechanisms. The specific interpretation of these phenomena as evidence for the literal reincarnation that some traditions teach is a metaphysical addition to the empirical findings, rather than a direct implication of them. The honest engagement with this research requires distinguishing what has actually been established from what has been added through cultural projection and interpretive overreach. The research is interesting, but the popular literature has often presented it in forms that exceed what the careful application of the research would support. The popular claims that have made memories evidence for specific spiritual frameworks deserve particular caution. The claims that include specific past life identifications, the claims that include elaborate karmic narratives connecting current circumstances to specific past life events, the claims that include therapeutic techniques for accessing past life memories, are all distortions of what careful inquiry has actually established. The contemplative traditions did teach doctrines of reincarnation in various forms, but they taught these doctrines within frameworks of moral and spiritual seriousness that the popular distortions abandon. The contemporary research has documented phenomena that resist materialist reduction, but the research has not established the specific narratives that the popular literature has constructed. The honest engagement with these questions requires distinguishing what has actually been established from what has been added through cultural projection and commercial exploitation. The technical reasons for skepticism about the strongest popular claims have been articulated by various researchers who have engaged with these questions seriously. The work of cognitive psychologists on the constructive nature of memory provides substantial explanatory resources for many cases that have been presented as past life memories, with the documented cognitive biases that produce false memories being capable of producing specific apparent recollections that have no actual historical basis. The phenomenon of cryptomnesia, in which information that has been encountered earlier in life is later recalled without recognition of its source, accounts for additional cases. The cumulative effect of these explanations is substantial, even as some specific cases continue to resist easy reduction. The careful position is to recognize what the cognitive science has established about the biases that produce many apparent past life memories, while also acknowledging that some specific cases warrant continued investigation rather than summary dismissal. What the actual physics and the careful research do provide, however, is a framework within which the deeper question can be formulated. The framework does not establish that specific memories provide access to past lives in the literal sense. The framework establishes that the deepest physical structure of reality is more sophisticated than classical thinking allowed, with the implications for understanding what memory actually accesses being a question that current research is working to address. The careful application of these findings to questions about memory involves the recognition of structural parallels rather than the assertion of direct mechanistic identity. The relationships between consciousness and the events that memory seems to be about have features that have structural parallel with the connections between distant systems that quantum mechanics has established. The features are not the same, but the parallels are not coincidence either, and the inquiry into what they suggest about the deeper structure of memory and reality is one of the central concerns of the contemporary investigation that the inquiry has been pursuing. The position that has been articulated by David Chalmers, Galen Strawson, and other contemporary philosophers concerning the relationship between consciousness and physical substrate provides a complementary framework for thinking about memory. If consciousness is, as the various proto-panpsychist positions suggest, a fundamental feature of physical reality rather than an emergent product of complex physical configurations, then memory may involve features of consciousness that the merely materialist framework cannot capture. The framework provides resources for thinking about why memory has the specific phenomenological features it has, with the apparent transport into the remembered past, the effective intensity of significant memories, and the capacity for involuntary recollection being natural consequences of the fundamental status of consciousness that the framework articulates. The framework is speculative in its specific applications, but it provides a precise philosophical vocabulary within which the questions about memory can be formulated more rigorously than the merely materialist framework allows. The specific contribution that Chalmers's work has made to these questions has been the rigorous articulation of why the materialist framework faces fundamental difficulties in accounting for the qualitative character of conscious experience. The hard problem of consciousness, as Chalmers articulated it in his 1995 paper in the Journal of Consciousness Studies and developed in his subsequent book The Conscious Mind, identifies the gap between any physical description of brain processes and the subjective experience that the processes seem to produce. The implications for understanding memory follow from the broader framework. The experience of remembering, with its specific phenomenology, including the apparent transport into the past and the effective resonance of significant recollections, has features that resist reduction to physical processes in the same way that other forms of conscious experience resist this reduction. The framework does not by itself establish what memory actually involves at the deepest level, but the framework provides a context within which the question can be formulated rigorously rather than dismissed. The convergence of these various frameworks on the recognition that the deepest structure of reality involves features that the merely materialist framework cannot adequately capture provides a context within which the documented phenomena of memory can be understood without forcing them into the materialist mold. The frameworks do not establish any specific alternative to the materialist account as the correct account of memory. The frameworks establish that the materialist objection, the claim that the principles of physics and philosophy of mind rule out any deeper account of memory, is not actually supported by careful examination. The principles of physics and philosophy, properly understood, are consistent with deeper accounts that the contemplative traditions have articulated. But the consistency is not equivalent to demonstration, and the strongest forms of the alternative accounts remain speculative, even as they are framed within the rigorous physics and philosophy that have been established. The careful position with respect to all of these frameworks is to recognize what they offer and what they do not offer for the inquiry into memory. They offer alternatives to the materialist framework that has dominated mainstream discussion, with the alternatives being grounded in serious physics and philosophy. They do not offer definitive answers to the questions about what memory actually involves, with the questions remaining open in ways that current research is working to address. They provide a context within which the contemplative traditions, which have addressed these questions across thousands of years, can be engaged seriously rather than dismissed as merely the products of pre-scientific thinking. The traditions, on this convergent reading, may have been articulating in their own different vocabularies recognitions about the structure of memory that the contemporary physics is now in a position to engage with seriously. The next stage of the inquiry will examine these traditional articulations in detail, with the recognition that the traditions and the contemporary research are addressing the same underlying phenomenon from their own different angles, and that the convergence between them is one of the most striking convergences in the entire history of human thought about what memory actually is and what it actually accomplishes. Long before any laboratory could measure memory reconsolidation, or any framework existed for thinking about holographic neural encoding, contemplative thinkers in widely separated cultures arrived at structurally parallel pictures of what memory actually is and what role it plays in conscious existence. The methods used were not measurement and theory in the modern technical sense. The methods used were sustained attention to memory itself, to the contemplative practices that engage memory directly while still embodied, and to the philosophical reflection on what memory must be, if it is the kind of thing that the traditions have observed it to be across thousands of years of careful examination. What these thinkers found, in their own different vocabularies, was that memory is not merely the cognitive function that the materialist framework treats it as, but is a fundamental feature of how consciousness operates and how the embodied life engages with dimensions of reality that exceed the merely present moment. The convergence between these contemplative recognitions and what contemporary research has begun to document about memory is one of the most striking convergences in the entire history of human thought, and the deeper inquiry that follows requires careful engagement with what each major tradition has articulated. The most philosophically sophisticated treatment of memory in any contemplative tradition appears in the Christian tradition through the work of Augustine of Hippo, whose 10th book of the Confessions provides what remains one of the most rigorous philosophical analyses of memory ever produced. Augustine, writing in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, devoted substantial attention to memory across his theological work, but reached his most concentrated treatment of the subject in the Confessions. The book was completed around 400 of the Common Era, with the 10th book being a sustained philosophical investigation of memory that proceeds through extended self-examination and reflection on what the experience of remembering actually involves. The treatment has shaped Western thinking about memory across more than 16 centuries, with the framework continuing to be studied within both theological and philosophical contexts into the present. The opening of Augustine's investigation in the 10th book establishes the basic framework within which his analysis proceeds. Augustine asks what he loves when he loves God, with the question leading him into an extended examination of what the soul actually is and how it operates. The investigation moves through the various senses and finds in each one something that points beyond itself, eventually arriving at memory as the interior space within which the materials of conscious experience are encountered and engaged. The famous passage in which Augustine describes the fields and palaces of memory captures the phenomenological richness of memory in language that subsequent reflection has continued to find rewarding. The passage describes memory as a vast interior space with countless contents that consciousness can engage in various ways, and with the contents being encountered through processes that the analysis works to characterize. Augustine's specific articulation of how memory operates draws on careful observation of what actually happens when memory is engaged. The analysis distinguishes the various kinds of contents that memory holds, including the sensory impressions that have been received through the various senses, the emotional states that have been experienced, the abstract concepts that the mind has grasped, and the mathematical truths that the mind recognizes. The analysis examines how each kind of content is held in memory, and how each is retrieved when memory is engaged. The treatment is phenomenologically careful, with the descriptions matching what attentive examination of one's own memory actually reveals rather than imposing theoretical structures from outside. The deeper philosophical question that Augustine's analysis addresses concerns what memory is in itself, beyond the various contents that it holds. The investigation arrives at the recognition that memory is not merely a container for contents, but is somehow connected to the very identity of the soul. The famous formulation that memory is a kind of belly of the mind, the great storehouse where the impressions of all senses are received and stored, captures only part of what Augustine's analysis reveals. The deeper recognition is that memory is constitutive of who one is, with the identity of the person being substantially constituted by what is held in memory, rather than memory being a separate function that operates on a more fundamental self. The framework has substantial parallels with what contemporary research has documented about how the felt sense of personal continuity is constituted by memory, with the contemporary findings adding empirical specificity to what Augustine's philosophical analysis had already articulated. Augustine's specific treatment of how memory holds different kinds of contents repays careful examination. The investigation distinguishes how sensory impressions are held in memory from how emotional states are held, with the distinction being important for understanding the phenomenology of remembering. Sensory impressions are held in memory as images of what the senses have received, with the images being available to consciousness in ways that allow the original sensory experience to be reproduced in modified form. Emotional states are held in memory in a different manner, with the recall of past emotional states often producing effective resonance that approximates but does not fully reproduce the original experience. Abstract concepts and mathematical truths are held in yet another manner, with these contents being available to consciousness in ways that exceed what mere image storage could account for. The careful distinction among these different kinds of memory contents anticipates contemporary distinctions between episodic memory, emotional memory, and semantic memory, with the convergence between Augustine's phenomenological analysis and contemporary empirical research being one of the more striking convergences in the history of these questions. The treatment of forgetting in the 10th book of the Confessions deserves particular attention because of its philosophical sophistication. Augustine asks how forgetting can be remembered, with the question producing one of the most subtle parts of the analysis. The forgetting that we recognize when we say that we have forgotten something must somehow be present to consciousness in order to be recognized as forgetting, but if it is present, then it has not been entirely forgotten. The puzzle that this raises has been examined extensively across subsequent philosophical reflection, with various proposed solutions being offered. Augustine's own resolution involves the recognition that memory holds the awareness of having known something, even when the specific content is no longer accessible, with this awareness being itself a kind of memory that operates at a different level than the memory of specific contents. The framework has substantial parallels with contemporary distinctions between conscious recollection and feeling of knowing experiences, with the convergence between Augustine's analysis and contemporary cognitive psychology being another of the points where the comparative study of traditional and contemporary frameworks proves illuminating. Augustine's analysis includes a particularly striking treatment of how memory relates to the question of God's presence to the soul. The investigation arrives at the question of how God can be remembered, with the question producing one of the most philosophically sophisticated parts of the analysis. Augustine argues that the soul somehow always knows God even before it explicitly remembers God, with the memory of God being more fundamental than the memory of any particular embodied experience. The framework has been controversial within subsequent theology, but the framework articulates a recognition that has parallels in other traditions, including the Platonic tradition's doctrine of recollection. The convergence between Augustine's treatment and the broader philosophical tradition's engagement with these questions is one of the features that makes the comparative study of these traditions so illuminating. The Augustinian framework has been developed extensively by subsequent Christian thinkers, with the framework continuing to be studied within both theological and philosophical contexts. The work of Bonaventure in the 13th century articulated the Augustinian framework within his broader Franciscan theological framework, with the recognition that memory connects the soul to its divine origin, being one of the central concerns of his itinerarium, Mentis in Deum. The work of Thomas Aquinas integrated Augustinian elements with Aristotelian philosophical resources, producing a framework that addressed the relationship between memory and intellect with characteristic philosophical precision. The contemporary engagement with these questions, in figures including Paul Ricoeur, whose Memory, History, Forgetting provides one of the most extensive contemporary philosophical treatments of memory, continues to draw on the Augustinian framework even as it integrates contemporary phenomenological and hermeneutical resources. The Platonic tradition that influenced Augustine had developed its own sophisticated account of memory through the doctrine of anamnesis, recollection. The doctrine, articulated most fully in Plato's dialogues including the Meno, the Phaedo, and the Phaedrus, holds that the deepest knowledge that the soul possesses is knowledge that the soul had before its embodiment, with the process of learning being substantially the process of remembering what the soul once knew. The doctrine in the Meno is illustrated through the famous geometry lesson with the slave boy, who demonstrates the capacity to recognize geometric truths that he has not been taught, with the recognition being interpreted within the dialogue as evidence that the soul possesses the knowledge before the lesson begins. The doctrine has been controversial, with various philosophical traditions disagreeing about how literally it should be taken, but the doctrine articulates a recognition about memory that exceeds what the merely empiricist framework would allow. The Phaedo develops the doctrine of anamnesis in connection with the broader argument about the soul's immortality, with the recognition that the soul possesses knowledge that it could not have acquired in this embodied life, being treated as evidence that the soul existed before this embodiment. The doctrine in the Phaedrus connects memory to the soul's encounter with eternal forms, with the recovery of what the soul once knew being one of the central concerns of philosophical practice. The framework has had substantial influence on subsequent Western thinking about memory, with the influence extending through Christian Platonism into the broader tradition of philosophical reflection on these questions. The Augustinian treatment that we have examined builds explicitly on this Platonic foundation, with the integration of Christian theology and Platonic philosophy producing one of the most sophisticated frameworks for understanding memory that any tradition has developed. The Islamic tradition has developed its own substantial framework for understanding memory through its central practice of dhikr, the remembrance of God that constitutes one of the most foundational disciplines within both general Islamic religious life and the more specifically Sufi mystical traditions. The Quranic foundation for this practice appears in numerous passages that command the believer to remember God frequently, with the verb dakara that the Arabic uses being closely connected to the noun dhikr that names the practice. The Quran itself describes its own recitation as a remembrance, with the broader framework treating memory as one of the central modalities through which the religious life is conducted. The practice of dhikr has been developed across more than 14 centuries of Islamic spiritual life, with the specific forms varying across the different traditions but the underlying recognition being consistent. The Sufi mystical tradition has developed dhikr with particular sophistication, with the various Sufi orders developing specific practices for the cultivation of remembrance that range from silent inward repetition of the divine names to elaborate vocal practices that involve specific rhythmic patterns and bodily movements. The framework that the Sufi traditions have articulated treats dhikr as far more than merely a cognitive exercise. The practice is understood as the cultivation of a fundamental orientation of consciousness toward the divine reality, with the orientation transforming the practitioner through the very practice rather than through the achievement of any specific cognitive result. The recognition that memory is constitutive of who the practitioner is, articulated in different vocabulary by Augustine in the Christian tradition, has direct parallels in the Sufi understanding of dhikr as the practice through which the practitioner becomes who they are most fundamentally meant to be. The specific practices that the various Sufi orders have developed for the cultivation of dhikr deserve attention because of their phenomenological sophistication. The Naqshbandi order has emphasized silent dhikr, with the practitioner engaged in continuous inward remembrance that operates without external expression. The Mevlevi order, founded by the followers of Rumi, has developed the Sema practice in which dhikr is integrated with specific bodily movements that include the famous turning of the dervishes. The Qadiri order has developed forms of dhikr that involve specific rhythmic patterns of breathing and vocalization. The Shadhili order has developed forms that emphasize the integration of dhikr with the broader pattern of daily life. Despite the substantial variation across these different forms, The underlying recognition that the cultivation of remembrance is one of the central disciplines of the spiritual life has been consistent across the traditions. The Sufi concept of fikr, contemplative reflection, complements the practice of dhikr within the broader framework of Sufi practice. Fikr involves the active reflection on the meaning of what is being remembered, with the integration of remembrance and reflection being one of the central features of the more developed Sufi practice. The framework treats memory not as a passive holding of contents but as an active engagement with the divine reality that the contents point toward, with the practice transforming the practitioner through the very engagement. The convergence between this framework and the Augustinian recognition that memory is constitutive of identity rather than incidental to it is striking, with both traditions arriving at structurally parallel recognitions through their own different methods. The Sufi recognition that the heart is the locus of the deepest memory has parallels in various other contemplative traditions. The Sufi anatomy of subtle bodies, articulated across centuries of Sufi tradition, treats the heart as the seat of the deepest spiritual capacities, including the capacity for genuine remembrance of the divine. The framework has parallels with Christian contemplative traditions that have placed the heart at the center of spiritual life, with the practice of the prayer of the heart in Eastern Christian orthodoxy and the broader devotional emphasis on the heart in Western Christianity, reflecting similar recognitions. The convergence across these traditions on the heart as the locus of deepest memory, despite the substantial differences in their theological and metaphysical frameworks, is one of the features that the comparative study of these traditions reveals. The Persian Sufi poet Jalal al-Din Rumi, whose Mesnevi has been one of the most widely read poetic works in the Islamic world, addressed memory and dhikr across his vast corpus with characteristic depth. Rumi's verses on the recovery of the soul's primordial state, on the recognition of the divine reality that the soul has known before its embodied existence, and on the practice of dhikr as the means by which this recognition is cultivated, articulate one of the most sophisticated traditional frameworks for understanding what memory actually accomplishes when it operates at its deepest level. The famous opening of the Mesnevi, with its image of the reed cut from the reed bed crying for its origin, captures the recognition that the soul carries within itself a memory of its primordial state, with the embodied life being substantially the process of remembering what the soul has forgotten through the very fact of being embodied. The concept of Besmi Alest, which we have considered in earlier inquiries, has direct relevance for understanding the Islamic framework of memory at its deepest level. The Quranic verse 7-172 describes the divine address to all human souls before their embodied existence, with the souls being asked whether they recognize God as their Lord and responding affirmatively. The verse provides the foundation for an understanding of memory that connects the embodied existence to a primordial state that the embodied life is somehow oriented toward recovering. The Sufi traditions have developed this framework extensively, with the recognition that the deepest memory is not the memory of specific embodied experiences, but the memory of the primordial state that the soul has carried into embodied existence, and that the spiritual journey works to recover. The convergence between this framework and the Platonic doctrine of anamnesis is striking, with both frameworks articulating a recognition that memory operates at multiple levels, and that the deepest level connects the soul to what it knew before its embodied existence. The Hindu tradition has developed perhaps the most extensively articulated philosophical framework for understanding memory through its doctrines of samskara and vasana. The framework, developed across thousands of years within the broader Hindu philosophical traditions, treats actions and experiences as producing latent impressions in consciousness that ripen across time into subsequent experiences. The samskaras are the specific impressions that particular actions and experiences produce, with the impressions being held in consciousness in a form that is neither fully active nor entirely absent. The vasanas are the broader patterns of disposition that the accumulated samskaras produce, with the patterns shaping how the conscious being engages with subsequent experiences and decisions. The framework provides a sophisticated account of how memory operates across the span of conscious existence, with implications that extend beyond what the contemporary materialist framework can capture. The work of Patanjali in the Yoga Sutras provides one of the most rigorous philosophical articulations of these doctrines. The sutras, composed sometime between the 2nd century before the Common Era and the 2nd century of the Common Era, articulate the framework of yoga practice within which the engagement with samskaras and vasanas is one of the central concerns. The sutras define memory, smriti, in their first chapter as one of the fluctuations of consciousness that the yoga practice works to address. The definition treats smriti as the holding of contents that have been previously experienced, with the holding being one of the modalities through which consciousness operates. The broader framework that emerges from the sutras treats memory as deeply integrated with the karmic structure that connects actions to consequences across time, with the cultivation of awareness of how memory operates being one of the disciplines that the yoga practice develops. The specific framework that the Yoga Sutras articulate for working with samskaras and vasanas has been one of the most influential traditional accounts of how the contemplative life can engage with memory. The sutras describe how the accumulated samskaras and vasanas constitute the substantial content of what we ordinarily take ourselves to be, with the cultivation of awareness of these patterns being one of the means by which the deeper recognition of consciousness itself becomes accessible. The framework treats the practitioner not as a static self that has memories, but as a continuously formed pattern of memory contents that can be transformed through the very practice of attentive engagement with these contents. The convergence between this framework and the contemporary research on memory reconsolidation is striking, with the recognition that memory contents are continuously updated, providing empirical support for what the Yoga Sutras had articulated through their own different methods. Adi Shankara, the 8th century philosopher, whose Advaita Vedanta has been one of the most influential developments within the Hindu philosophical tradition, addressed memory across his extensive writings with characteristic philosophical precision. Shankara's framework holds that memory operates within the realm of conventional reality, with the deeper recognition of the non-dual ultimate reality, eventually transcending the conventional level, even as the framework operates with full force at its appropriate level. The implications for understanding memory are subtle but significant. The memory contents that constitute the felt sense of personal continuity are, on the framework, real at the conventional level, but are not the deepest reality of what the conscious being is. The deeper recognition is the recognition of the non-dual consciousness that underlies the various memory contents, with the recognition transforming the practitioner's relationship to memory, rather than eliminating memory itself. The Bhagavad Gita addresses memory at multiple points, with particular attention to the role of memory at the moment of death. The framework that the Gita articulates holds that the state of consciousness at the moment of death substantially shapes what follows, with the memory contents that are most active at that moment determining the subsequent trajectory of consciousness. The framework has been the foundation of substantial subsequent practice within Hindu spiritual life, with the cultivation of specific memory contents through devotional practice being one of the means by which practitioners prepare for the moment of death. The framework has parallels with Tibetan Buddhist teachings about the importance of consciousness at death, and with various Christian and Islamic teachings about the disposition of the soul as it approaches death, with a cross-traditional convergence on the significance of dying memory being one of the more striking features that the comparative study of these traditions reveals. The specific verse in the 8th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita that addresses dying memory states that whatever the embodied being remembers at the moment of leaving the body shapes what follows, with the framework being the foundation for the bhakti practice of cultivating constant remembrance of the divine across the span of life, so that this remembrance is naturally present at the moment of death. The framework treats the cultivation of memory as one of the most consequential disciplines that the embodied life involves, with the orientation of memory toward the divine being one of the central means by which the spiritual life is conducted. The convergence between this framework and the Sufi practice of dhikr that we have considered, with both traditions placing the cultivation of remembrance of God at the center of religious life, demonstrates how widely this recognition has been articulated across different traditions despite their substantial theological differences. The Buddhist tradition has developed its own framework for understanding memory through its central practice of sati, mindfulness. The Pali word sati, often translated as mindfulness in contemporary discussions, more literally means memory or remembrance, with the practice being substantially the cultivation of a particular kind of attentive awareness that includes the dimension of remembering what is happening and what has just happened. The framework that the tradition has articulated treats sati as one of the central practices of the path, with the cultivation of this particular quality of attentive remembering being one of the means by which the broader liberation that the tradition cultivates is achieved. The practice has been developed across more than 2,500 years of Buddhist tradition, with the specific forms varying across the different schools, but the underlying recognition being consistent. The etymological connection between sati and memory in the Pali language deserves particular attention because it illuminates what the Buddhist practice actually involves. The contemporary translation of sati as mindfulness has obscured the central role that remembrance plays in the practice, with the practice involving not merely attention to the present moment, but the active remembering of what consciousness is doing as it is doing it. The framework has been articulated in detail across the Buddhist tradition, with the Satipatthana Sutta providing one of the most foundational treatments of how the practice operates. The sutta describes the application of sati to the body, the feelings, the mind, and the mental contents, with the application involving in each case the active remembering of what is occurring rather than the merely passive observation that some contemporary translations have suggested. The contemporary mindfulness movement has popularized aspects of sati while sometimes obscuring its central connection to memory. The work of John Kabat-Zinn at the University of Massachusetts Medical School in developing mindfulness-based stress reduction has integrated Buddhist sati practices with Western clinical contexts, with substantial benefits documented across multiple research programs. The framework that Kabat-Zinn has developed has been influential, but the framework has emphasized the present moment awareness aspect of sati, while underemphasizing the memory dimension that the original Pali term centrally includes. The careful engagement with the Buddhist tradition recovers the dimension of remembrance that the contemporary mindfulness movement has sometimes obscured, with the recovery being one of the disciplines that contemporary scholarship on Buddhism has worked to develop. The Buddhist analysis of memory faces a particular philosophical challenge that the tradition has addressed with characteristic sophistication. The Buddhist doctrine of anatta, the absence of a persistent self that endures across time, raises the question of who or what does the remembering when memory occurs. If there is no persistent self that exists across the moments of conscious experience, how can memory operate to connect the present moment with past moments that the supposedly persistent self once experienced? The tradition has addressed this question through the framework of Chitta Santana, the mental continuum, which treats consciousness as a continuous stream of moments that exhibit the kind of continuity that memory requires without involving any persistent self that the moments would belong to. The framework has been one of the most sophisticated philosophical articulations of how memory can operate without requiring the persistent self that ordinary thinking assumes. The framework of pratitya samutpada, dependent origination, that we considered in our earlier examination of synchronicity, has direct relevance for understanding the Buddhist treatment of memory. The framework holds that all phenomena, including conscious experiences, arise in mutual dependence with all other phenomena, with no phenomenon having an independent existence apart from its relationships with the conditions that produce it. The implications for memory are substantial. Memory is, on the framework, not the persistence of stored contents within an enduring self, but the dependent arising of present experiences that are conditioned by past experiences without requiring any persistent vehicle for the connection. The framework has substantial parallels with the contemporary research on the constructive nature of memory, with the recognition that memory is fundamentally reconstructive rather than retrievable, being one of the points where the Buddhist tradition and contemporary research converge. The Jewish tradition has placed the imperative zachor, remember, at the center of its religious life with a directness that few other traditions have matched. The Hebrew Bible contains numerous specific commandments to remember, with the commandments addressing the historical experiences of the Jewish people, the obligations of the covenant relationship with God, and the ethical responsibilities that follow from the broader religious framework. The Passover Seder, the annual ritual that commemorates the Exodus from Egypt, embodies the imperative to remember in concrete liturgical form, with the ritual structure being designed to make the past events present to subsequent generations through the very practice of remembrance. The framework treats memory as constitutive of religious identity, with the obligation to remember being one of the central means by which the religious life is maintained across generations. The work of the historian Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, whose 1982 book, Zachor, Jewish History and Jewish Memory, provided one of the most influential contemporary treatments of the role of memory in Jewish tradition, articulated the framework within which the imperative to remember has shaped Jewish religious life across millennia. Yerushalmi's analysis emphasized that the Jewish tradition has developed a particular form of religious memory that operates through liturgical practice rather than through historical research in the modern sense, with the framework providing one of the most distinctive contributions to broader thinking about how memory operates in religious communities. The convergence between this framework and the broader recognition across other traditions that memory is constitutive of identity rather than incidental to it is one of the features that the comparative study of these traditions reveals. The Yom HaShoah commemoration, the modern Jewish commemoration of the Holocaust, extends the broader framework of Zachor to the specific historical trauma of the 20th century. The commemoration treats the obligation to remember as having particular force in the case of the Holocaust, with the recognition that the failure to remember would itself constitute a kind of additional wrong against the victims. The framework has been controversial in some respects, but the framework articulates a recognition that memory is not merely a cognitive function, but a moral and religious obligation that connects the present generation to the previous generations, whose experiences shape the broader meaning of the religious life. The convergence between this Jewish framework and the broader recognition across other traditions that memory is constitutive of identity rather than incidental to it is one of the features that the comparative study of these traditions reveals. What emerges across these various traditions, despite their profound differences in cultural context and theological commitment, is a structural recognition that has clear parallels to what contemporary research has begun to document about memory. The traditions consistently treat memory as more than the merely cognitive function that the materialist framework treats it as. The traditions consistently distinguish between ordinary habit memory and deeper memory that involves access to dimensions of reality that the merely habitual access does not provide. The traditions consistently develop practices for the cultivation of memory, with the practices ranging from the contemplative recollection that the Christian tradition has developed to the dhikr that the Islamic tradition has refined to the sati that the Buddhist tradition has cultivated, and the traditions consistently locate memory within broader frameworks of meaning that connect the individual life to larger patterns that the individual life participates in. The convergence is not equivalence. The Augustinian memoria is not the Sufi dhikr, is not the Hindu, samskara is not the Buddhist, sati is not the Platonic anamnesis, is not the Jewish zakor. Each tradition is doing its own work, with its own commitments, in its own context. The vocabularies differ. The metaphysical frameworks differ profoundly. What they share, despite these differences, is the recognition that memory is constitutive of who the conscious being is, that the cultivation of relationship to memory is one of the legitimate concerns of conscious existence, and that the contemporary research is now in a position to engage seriously with what the traditions have been articulating across thousands of years. The next stage of the inquiry will examine what these recognitions, taken together with the contemporary research that has been documenting the biology and physics of memory, suggest for how a person can inhabit the embodied existence in which memory is one of the principal modes through which conscious life is constituted. The memories that constitute who you are not the stable records of what actually happened that the dominant cultural framework has trained you to take them as. They are not the merely incidental cognitive function that the materialist framework reduces them to. They are not the literal access to past lives that some popular spiritual frameworks have claimed they could be. The memories are something more sophisticated than any of these reductions allows, with the something more being precisely what the inquiry has been working to articulate. The memories are continuously updated reconstructions that the brain produces in real time, with the reconstructions involving features that exceed what any merely cognitive account can fully capture. The memories are the means by which the felt sense of personal continuity is constituted, with the constitution being one of the most consequential dimensions of how conscious existence operates. The memories may involve features of consciousness and reality that the merely materialist framework cannot adequately address, with the contemporary physics and the contemplative traditions both providing resources for thinking about these features without forcing them into the materialist mold. The synthesis that follows draws together the various strands of the inquiry. The synthesis is not the final word on questions that remain genuinely open. The synthesis is the recognition of what the convergent evidence suggests, of what objections honest investigation has to acknowledge, and of what specific implications follow for how a person can inhabit a life in which memory is one of the principal modes through which conscious experience is constituted. Before drawing out the implications, intellectual honesty requires examining the objections to everything that has been argued. The picture we have built is not the only available reading of the evidence, and several alternative views have serious philosophical and scientific defenders. Any account that ignores them is a form of intellectual cheating. The first and most important objection comes from the materialist position that has been the dominant framework in mainstream memory research for the past several decades. The position holds that memory is, at its deepest level, the operation of specific neural mechanisms that contemporary neuroscience has worked to characterize in detail. The work of Kandel on the cellular and molecular mechanisms of memory, the work of Karim Nader on memory reconsolidation, the work of LeDoux on emotional memory, and the work of countless other researchers across the past several decades has produced a substantially complete account of how memory operates at the biological level. The position holds that this account is sufficient, with the apparent features of memory that exceed the merely biological being, either reducible to the biology or being simply features of how the biology produces the experience of remembering. The position has serious defenders within contemporary neuroscience, and the empirical achievements of the materialist framework are substantial. The honest acknowledgement is that the materialist objection cannot be summarily dismissed. The neural mechanisms are real mechanisms. The biology of memory is increasingly characterized. The cognitive functions that memory accomplishes are well documented. What the inquiry has established is that the materialist account does not exhaust what the documented phenomena involve, with features including the involuntary memory phenomenon, the apparent novelty of some memory contents, and the deeper philosophical questions about what relationship the experience of remembering has to the past events that the experience seems to be about, all raising features that the merely materialist account does not adequately address. The position that memory is reducible to biology is not the established scientific consensus that some popular accounts have presented it as. The position is one available framework among several, with serious empirical and philosophical considerations that current research has not fully resolved. The second objection focuses on the speculative status of the philosophical extensions that we have considered. The Pribram holographic brain framework, while supported by interesting empirical observations and mathematical formalisms, has not been incorporated into the consensus understanding of how the brain operates. The Bohm implicate order framework, while developed by a serious physicist, has not been incorporated into the consensus physics of the mainstream community. The Penrose-Hameroff orchestrated objective reduction theory, while supported by some recent empirical work, remains controversial within the broader neuroscience community. The application of any of these frameworks to specific questions about memory involves theoretical extensions that have not been definitively established. The honest acknowledgement is that the philosophical frameworks provide resources for thinking about memory beyond the materialist framework, but the frameworks do not by themselves establish that memory is what these frameworks suggest it might be. The third objection focuses on the popular abuse of the inquiry's themes in contemporary spiritual literature. The recognition that memory may have dimensions beyond the merely cognitive has been seized upon by various popularizers to develop frameworks that exceed what either the science or the traditions actually support. The claims that include specific past life identifications through hypnotic regression, the claims that include elaborate karmic narratives connecting current circumstances to specific past life events, the claims that include therapeutic techniques for accessing memories of cosmic origins, are all distortions of what careful inquiry has actually established. The contemplative traditions did teach doctrines that included reincarnation in various forms, but they taught these doctrines within frameworks of moral and spiritual seriousness that the popular distortions abandon. The contemporary research has documented phenomena that resist materialist reduction, but the research has not established the specific narratives that the popular literature has constructed. The honest engagement with these questions requires distinguishing what has actually been established from what has been added through cultural projection and commercial exploitation. The contemporary phenomenon of past life regression therapy deserves particular examination because of the substantial commercial industry that has developed around it. The technique typically involves hypnotic induction followed by suggestions that subjects remember experiences from supposed previous lives, with the experiences being treated as evidence for reincarnation in the literal sense. The careful evaluation of this technique requires acknowledging what the contemporary research on hypnosis and memory has established. Hypnosis can produce vivid subjective experiences that have no basis in actual events, with the experiences being indistinguishable to the subject from genuine memories. The work of Elizabeth Loftus and other researchers on suggestibility has provided substantial documentation of how readily memory-like content can be generated through hypnotic suggestion. The implications for past life regression are clear. The technique cannot reliably produce evidence of past lives because the technique itself produces vivid subjective experiences that may have no basis in any actual events. The careful research that Stevenson and Tucker have conducted on spontaneous past life memories in young children operates through entirely different methodology and produces findings that warrant separate evaluation, but the popular regression industry has often conflated its claims with this more careful research in ways that distort what either has actually established. A related popular phenomenon that deserves caution is the recovered memory therapy industry that flourished in the 1980s and 1990s before the broader scientific community recognized its substantial problems. The therapy involved various techniques designed to recover supposedly repressed memories of childhood trauma, with the recovered memories being treated as veridical records of actual events. The careful research on memory has established that the techniques used in this therapy can produce vivid false memories that subjects experience as genuine recollections, with the implications having included substantial harm to families that were torn apart by accusations based on these false memories. The legal and clinical implications have been substantial, with the recognition of the problems with recovered memory therapy producing significant changes in how memory-based testimony is evaluated. The careful engagement with memory requires recognizing both what the therapy industry got wrong and what the contemporary cognitive science has established about how memory can be reshaped through suggestion. The fourth objection concerns the related popular claim that memories provide reliable access to absolute truth about the past. The claim treats memories as if they were veridical records that can be trusted as direct access to what actually happened, with the implications being that disputes about past events can be resolved by appeal to memory. The careful research that we have examined establishes that this claim is fundamentally mistaken. Memories are reconstructions that occur each time they are accessed, with the reconstructions being shaped by current cognitive and emotional states, as well as by the materials that the original encoding produced. The famous research of Elizabeth Loftus has documented that memories can be substantially modified through suggestion, with subjects coming to remember events that never occurred when appropriately prompted. The implications for legal practice, for therapeutic practice, and for everyday confidence in one's own memories are substantial. The popular framework that treats memory as reliable testimony about the past is incompatible with what the careful research has documented. The fifth objection concerns the difference between healthy and unhealthy forms of engagement with memory. The contemplative traditions have all recognized that not every relationship to memory is a manifestation of the deeper engagement that the traditions cultivate. Some relationships involve excessive attachment to specific memory contents, with the experiencer being unable to release memories that the broader life would benefit from releasing. Some relationships involve obsessive examination of past events, with the experiencer being unable to engage with the present because of the constant return to past events that the obsessive examination produces. Some relationships involve traumatic intrusion, with memories of past trauma intruding into present consciousness in ways that prevent the broader life from proceeding. The contemplative traditions have all developed resources for distinguishing the genuine engagement with memory from these various distorted forms, with the discernment being one of the central disciplines that the traditions cultivate. The honest engagement with the inquiry's themes requires preserving these distinctions rather than collapsing them into the simpler frameworks that popular literature has often offered. The sixth objection concerns the relationship between the various contemplative traditions whose articulations the inquiry has examined. The traditions are not equivalent, and treating them as if they were equivalent does violence to the specific commitments of each. The Augustinian Memoria, with its specific commitments about the soul's relationship to God, is not the same as the Sufi dhikr, with its specific commitments about the practitioner's orientation toward the divine reality. The Hindu samskara framework, with its specific framework of moral causation across embodied lives, is not the same as the Buddhist sati practice, with its specific framework of attentive remembrance without persistent self. The Platonic anamnesis, with its specific commitments about the soul's pre-embodied knowledge, is not the same as the Jewish Zakor, with its specific commitments about communal historical memory. The differences matter. The differences are not surface features that can be dissolved into a common essence without losing what each tradition is actually saying. The honest engagement requires acknowledging the differences while also acknowledging the structural parallels. The seventh objection concerns the temptation to use the inquiry's themes as a substitute for the harder work of actually engaging with memory in concrete circumstances. The recognition that memory may have dimensions beyond the merely cognitive can become a way of avoiding the specific therapeutic, ethical, and spiritual work that engagement with memory requires. The contemplative traditions have all warned against this temptation in their own different ways. The Christian tradition has emphasized that the engagement with memory operates within the broader work of moral and spiritual development, with the engagement being one element of this broader work, rather than a substitute for it. The Buddhist tradition has emphasized that the cultivation of sati operates within the broader path of liberation, with the practice being one element of this broader path rather than the totality of what liberation requires. The Sufi tradition has emphasized that dhikr operates within the broader framework of religious life that includes ethical conduct, community engagement, and the practical demands of embodied existence. The honest engagement with the inquiry's themes requires holding the recognition of memory's depth together with the engagement with actual life, rather than allowing the former to function as an escape from the latter. When all of these objections have been weighed, what survives is not a metaphysical certainty, but a structural picture that holds up under examination. The neuroscience documents real phenomena that exceed what the simplest materialist framework allows. The philosophical extensions provide frameworks within which these phenomena can be understood without forcing them into the merely materialist mold. The contemplative traditions have articulated, in their own different vocabularies, structurally parallel pictures of what memory actually is and what role it plays in conscious existence. The convergences are real, even as the specific frameworks of science, philosophy, and tradition remain distinct. And the implications for how a person can understand the memories that constitute who they are follow from the recognition rather than from any specific metaphysical commitment. The picture has connections to many other strands of inquiry that have been pursued in this larger investigation. The recognition that consciousness disappears every night during the deep stages of sleep, only to reconstitute in the morning through mechanisms that current research is still working to fully characterize, has direct implications for understanding how memory bridges these disruptions. The continuity of personal identity across the daily disruption of sleep is substantially constituted by the memories that connect the waking person who returns each morning to the waking person who departed the previous night. The investigation of how this connection actually works is one of the central questions that the broader inquiry has been pursuing, with the implications for understanding what the self actually is being significant. The recognition that consciousness during dreaming may have access to features of reality that the merely materialist framework does not address has implications for the memory phenomena that occur during dreams. The dreams that appear to involve memories of events the dreamer did not consciously experience, the dreams that include figures from the dreamer's past with vividness that exceeds ordinary recall, and the dreams that produce memories that the dreamer subsequently treats as if they had been actual experiences, all participate in the broader picture that the inquiry has been examining. The phenomena are not definitively established as involving any specific kind of access beyond what cognitive reconstruction would produce, but the phenomena are part of the broader documentation, with the relationship between dreaming and memory being one of the features that the larger investigation continues to address. The recognition that the bond between persons that we have examined in connection with love includes features that exceed the merely psychological has direct implications for understanding the memories that involve specific persons we have loved. The neurological research on bonded couples has documented that partners maintain neural representations of each other that operate even during their physical separation. The implications for how memories of the persons we have loved are structured follow naturally from the broader picture. The persons we have loved are not, on this framework, merely external others whose images we have stored in memory. The persons are integrated into the very structure of who we are, with the memories of them being the means by which the integration is sustained across the disruptions that physical separation and death produce. The recognition that the question of what happens to consciousness at biological death cannot be answered through the standard materialist framework has direct implications for understanding what happens to the memories that constitute who we are when consciousness reaches its final embodied moment. The framework that the Bhagavad Gita articulates, with its claim that the state of consciousness at the moment of death substantially shapes what follows, takes on additional weight when it is read alongside the contemporary research on the persistence of consciousness through the dying process. The memories that are most active at the moment of death may have a significance that exceeds what the merely biological framework would suggest, with the implications for how we cultivate memory across the span of life being part of what the inquiry has been pursuing. The recognition that meaningful coincidences may have a structural basis that the standard frameworks cannot adequately address has direct relevance for understanding the experiences of memory that include apparently meaningful patterns, connecting specific recollections to current circumstances. The synchronicity framework that we examined provides resources for understanding why memories sometimes appear with particular force at particular moments, with the appearance being meaningful rather than merely random. The framework does not require any specific physical mechanism for these connections, with the connections being expressions of the deeper structures that the synchronicity framework articulates. The implications for how the appearance of memories should be received, with attention to what their appearance might mean rather than mere dismissal of them as random, follow naturally from the broader picture. The recognition that time may not have the structure that ordinary perception suggests, articulated through the block universe interpretation of relativity that the inquiry has examined, has direct implications for understanding what relationship memory has to the past events that the memories seem to be about. If the past exists with equal reality to the present in the broader space-time structure, then memory is not merely the brain's reconstruction from internally stored patterns, but may be the consciousness's engagement with events that genuinely exist in the broader structure. The framework is speculative in its strongest forms, but the convergence between the contemporary physics and the philosophical traditions that have articulated similar recognitions provides resources for thinking about memory that exceed what the merely materialist framework allows. The recognition that the question of what happens to consciousness at biological death cannot be answered through the standard materialist framework has direct implications for understanding what happens to the memories that constitute who we are when consciousness reaches its final embodied moment. The framework that the Bhagavad Gita articulates, with its claim that the state of consciousness at the moment of death substantially shapes what follows, takes on additional weight when it is read alongside the contemporary research on the persistence of consciousness through the dying process. The memories that are most active at the moment of death may have a significance that exceeds what the merely biological framework would suggest, with the implications for how we cultivate memory across the span of life being part of what the inquiry has been pursuing. The recognition that meaningful coincidences may have a structural basis that the standard frameworks cannot adequately address has direct relevance for understanding the experiences of memory that include apparently meaningful patterns, connecting specific recollections to current circumstances. The synchronicity framework that we examine provides resources for understanding why memories sometimes appear with particular force at particular moments, with the appearance being meaningful rather than merely random. The framework does not require any specific physical mechanism for these connections, with the connections being expressions of the deeper structures that the synchronicity framework articulates. The implications for how the appearance of memories should be received, with attention to what their appearance might mean rather than mere dismissal of them as random, follow naturally from the broader picture. The recognition that dreams may have features exceeding what the standard cognitive account allows has direct relevance to the memory phenomena that occur during dreaming. The traditional accounts of dreams that involve memories of deceased persons, dreams that involve apparently veridical access to past events, and dreams that include information the dreamer could not have acquired through ordinary channels are all part of the broader literature on memory that the inquiry has been examining. The phenomena are not definitively established in any specific form, with the relevant research remaining controversial within mainstream psychology. But the phenomena are part of the broader documentation, and the relationship between these phenomena and the broader inquiry into memory is part of what the larger investigation has been pursuing. The recognition that the deepest physical structure of reality involves features that exceed what the merely classical framework allows provides a context within which memory can be understood without forcing it into the merely classical mold. The memory that you are about to engage when you next remember something is not, on the broader picture that the inquiry has been examining, the simple retrieval of stored content that the materialist framework would suggest. The memory is the engagement of consciousness with patterns that exist in the broader informational and possibly temporal structure of reality, with the engagement being the means by which the past becomes accessible to present consciousness. The framework is speculative in its strongest forms, but the recognition that the materialist framework is not the only available framework provides resources for understanding memory that the merely materialist framework cannot offer. These traditions, taken together with the contemporary research and the philosophical extensions, converge on a practical orientation that bears on what to do with the recognition that has been the subject of the inquiry. The orientation involves a different relationship to memory than the relationship that the standard cultural framework allows. The traditions have all developed practices that cultivate this different relationship, and the practices have served, across thousands of years, as the means by which the recognition is transmitted from one generation of practitioners to the next. There are particular practices that the contemplative traditions have developed for this kind of cultivation, and they are simpler than they might appear. The first is the practice of contemplative attention to one's own memory, in the manner that Augustine articulated in the 10th book of the Confessions. The practice involves the regular examination of what is held in memory and what relationship one has to the contents, with the examination being itself one of the means by which the relationship to memory is cultivated. The practice does not require any specific theological commitment in the strong sense. The practice requires only the willingness to attend to one's own memory with a kind of philosophical seriousness that Augustine modelled. The accumulated examination over time produces what Augustine called the cultivation of an interior life, with the cultivation being one of the means by which the conscious being becomes more fully who they are. A second practice draws on the Sufi tradition of dhikr and the related practices of remembrance that the various religious traditions have developed. The practice involves the regular cultivation of remembrance of what is most fundamental in the practitioner's understanding of reality, with the specific contents of the remembrance varying across the different traditions, but with the underlying discipline being similar. The practice does not require the specific theological commitments that the various traditions have developed. The practice requires only the willingness to engage in regular cultivation of the kind of attentive remembrance that the traditions have refined across centuries. The transformation that the practice produces operates through the very repetition of the remembrance, with the repetition transforming the practitioner through patterns that operate beneath the level of explicit cognitive engagement. A third practice draws on the Buddhist tradition of sati and the broader recognition that the cultivation of attentive memory transforms the practitioner's relationship to experience. The practice involves the deliberate cultivation of a quality of attention that includes the dimension of remembrance, with the practitioner being aware of what is occurring and remembering what has just occurred as the experience continues. The practice has been adapted in various contemporary forms, including mindfulness-based stress reduction, with the contemporary forms producing documented benefits for psychological well-being. The careful engagement with the practice recovers the dimension of memory that the contemporary mindfulness movement has sometimes obscured, with the recovery being one of the disciplines that distinguishes the genuine cultivation from the popularized versions. A fourth practice involves the maintenance of a memory journal, in which significant memories are recorded as they occur, with the recording being more disciplined and more honest than ordinary memory typically permits. The practice does not require treating the recorded memories as veridical records of past events, with the recognition that memory is reconstructive being incorporated into the very structure of the practice. The practice involves recording what is remembered while also acknowledging the alternative interpretations that cognitive science would suggest, with the integration of the phenomenology and the skeptical analysis being one of the features that distinguishes the practice from merely uncritical journaling. The accumulated record over time provides the foundation for examining patterns in one's own memory that single instances would not reveal, with the examination being one of the means by which the relationship to memory deepens over time. A fifth practice involves the cultivation of forgiveness as a transformation of memory rather than as a separate moral achievement. The contemporary research on memory reconsolidation that we examined has demonstrated that memories can be modified through specifically timed interventions during their retrieval, with the modification being available for therapeutic purposes. The contemplative traditions have all recognized that the engagement with painful memories can transform the memories themselves, with forgiveness being one of the means by which this transformation operates. The practice involves the deliberate retrieval of painful memories in the context of intentions that the traditions have developed for engaging with such memories, with the retrieval being followed by the kind of orientation that the traditions identify as the means by which forgiveness operates. The practice does not require denying the pain or pretending that the memories do not contain real difficulty. The practice involves engaging with the memories in ways that allow the broader life to proceed without being permanently determined by the past events that the memories preserve. These practices are simple, but they accumulate. Practiced over time, they shift the relationship between the rememberer and the memories. The relationship becomes less an unconscious automatism and more a conscious engagement that contributes to the broader life. The attention to memory becomes less an occasional return to the past, and more a sustained orientation that informs how the practitioner lives. The shift is not dramatic in any single instance. The shift is the gradual deepening of relationship with one of the principal modes through which conscious life is constituted, with the deepening being possible across the entire span of the embodied existence in which the remembering continues. This is what the inquiry has been pointing toward. Not a doctrine, not a system, not a framework that has to be believed. A recognition. A recognition that the memories that constitute who you are not the stable archival records that the dominant cultural framework has trained you to take them as. A recognition that the experience of remembering involves features that exceed what the merely materialist framework can adequately address, with the features pointing toward the deeper structures of consciousness and reality that physics and philosophy and the contemplative traditions have all been working to articulate. A recognition that the cultivation of relationship to memory is one of the legitimate concerns of conscious existence, that the cultivation can be practiced through the methods that the traditions have developed across thousands of years, and that the cultivation has effects on the embodied life that you currently have. The question of whether the philosophical and contemplative frameworks that have been examined are correct in their strongest forms is a question that no current investigation can answer with full certainty. The question of how you can inhabit a life in which memory is one of the principal modes of consciousness, in light of the recognitions that the inquiry has pointed toward, is a question that you are in a position to answer through the choices you make and the practices you cultivate. The body that reads these words has, across the years of its existence, accumulated what feels like a continuous record of experiences that constitutes the felt sense of who you are. The findings that contemporary research has documented suggest that this felt sense is substantially less accurate than ordinary perception would suggest. The memories that constitute the record are not stable archival records, but continuously updated reconstructions. The persons you remember are not the persons you actually knew. The events you remember are not the events that actually occurred. The continuous self that the memories seem to support is itself a construction that the memory system produces in real time, with the construction being so seamless that it is mistaken for direct access to a continuous past. None of this is hypothetical. All of this is the documented condition of your actual existence as a remembering being. But this is only part of what the inquiry has been pointing toward. The fact that memory is reconstructive does not mean that memory is empty. The fact that memory is constructed does not mean that what memory accomplishes is illusory. The fact that you cannot trust your memories as veridical records of past events does not mean that memory is not constitutive of who you are. The fact that the continuous self is a construction does not mean that the construction is meaningless. The recognition that the inquiry has been pointing toward is more sophisticated than either the naive trust in memory that the dominant cultural framework cultivates, or the cynical dismissal of memory that some skeptical responses produce. The recognition is that memory is the active production of who you are through the engagement with patterns that exist in some form that exceeds what the merely materialist framework can capture, with the production being something that you participate in rather than something that simply happens to you. When you next find yourself remembering, when some unexpected cue triggers a recollection that arrives with vividness and emotional resonance, consider for a moment what is actually happening. The experience is not the retrieval of a stored record from some archive in your brain. The experience is the active construction of what feels like a return to the past, with the construction drawing on patterns that have been shaped by previous experiences and that are available to present consciousness through processes that current research is working to characterize. The construction may involve features of consciousness and reality that exceed what the merely materialist framework can capture. The construction is what you are doing right now as you remember. The choice of how to engage what is being constructed, with what quality of attention and what depth of recognition, is the choice that constitutes one of the central forms of your conscious life. You have time. The time is finite. The memories that constitute who you are will continue to be reconstructed across the remaining span of your embodied existence, with the reconstructions being shaped by the choices you make about how to engage with what you remember, what you do with the memories, what kind of relationship you cultivate with this central feature of your existence, is among the most consequential dimensions of how you inhabit the life you have. The recognition that the inquiry has been pointing toward will not be available to you in the moments when it is most needed as a theoretical framework for analysis. The recognition will be available, if it is available at all, as the cultivated background that has informed your engagement with your memories across the years that preceded the moments. The cultivation matters. The practices matter. The recognition that memory is something more than what the materialist framework allows, while also something different from what the popular spiritual literature has claimed, is a recognition that produces its effects through the gradual transformation of how the rememberer engages with the trajectory of their existence. You will remember today. You will remember tomorrow. You will continue to remember across the remaining span of your existence. The question is what you make of this remembering, what kind of relationship you cultivate with the memories that constitute who you are. The choice is yours alone to make. The memories that have shaped you across the years of your existence are not stored somewhere in your brain like files in a cabinet. The memories are happening now. They are being constructed now as you read these words, and as the events of your day continue to unfold. The construction draws on patterns that have been shaped by previous experiences, but the construction itself occurs in the present moment, with each act of remembering being a present act rather than a retrieval of something completed in the past. The implications for how you understand who you are follow directly. You are not the person who has accumulated a record of past experiences. You are the person who is constructing the experience of having had those experiences right now, in the present moment, as the embodied life continues. This recognition does not diminish the reality of what you carry from your past. The recognition transforms how you understand what carrying actually involves, with the carrying being an active process rather than a passive storage. What you do with this active process, how you participate in the construction of who you are through the engagement with what you remember, is the question whose answer you are in a position to develop through the practices you cultivate and the discernment you bring to the memories that punctuate your existence.